The first challenge I would say is just absolute overwhelm. Most people who come are completely overwhelmed. It's usually one more thing has happened that has caused a lot of overwhelm. So people, especially during COVID was a big source of overwhelm. Now it could be taking on a new project, having kids, but usually people are sort of saying, hey, I barely had my organizational systems together. I was handing in things mostly on time. I was, keeping track of my events that were coming up I was talking to my family and friends semi-regularly, and then something else happened and that whole thing just fell apart, and now I really need help. That's usually where people are at.
Hi, I'm Renata Bernardi, and this is the Job Hunting Podcast, where I interview experts and professionals and discuss issues that are important for job hunters and those who are working to advance their careers. So make sure that you subscribe and follow, and let's dive right in. Okay, and how did you find me?
Just looking around, because, our audience is I work with professionals who have ADHD. And so, we like to go on Spotify and just search, jobs, job hunting, things like that. I'm always curious to find out what's out there. I was listening to an episode of yours right before about video and how video is going to be sort of a focus now potentially in applications. So this is kind of my bread and butter. This is where I hang out.
Okay. Do you find that because of the podcast, your clientele is broader than just New Zealanders? I'm assuming it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We don't really have any clients from New Zealand, actually. Most of our clients are from the US, Australia, and the UK.
Yeah, same here. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's weird, right? You're like,
it makes us work odd hours of the day, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is my lunchtime.
All right.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear from you your personal journey with ADHD. When did you first found out that your brain operated slightly differently? Is that how you would explain it?
Yeah, so I think that's a good way. So I was actually starting a doctorate. So I had a sort of, my first career was as an academic. And when I started, I really wanted to get some support. I went to the Inclusive Learning Center there because I don't know, writing essays, sometimes it would go well, sometimes it would go terribly. I thought maybe I had dyslexia. That was something that had been talked about in my family. So I went and they did a bunch of tests. It took I think it took maybe two different days. And afterwards they said, look, we don't know for sure about dyslexia, but we're pretty confident you have ADHD. And that was a real surprise. I actually taught developmental psychology, so I had an understanding of ADHD in kids, but at the time, ADHD in adults, it wasn't really discussed at all, not even in psychology. And so that was the beginning of a real journey for me, understanding what that looked like.
And what does it take to get a diagnosis for ADHD as an adult? So why did they figure that out?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So that wasn't the diagnosis. That was an assessment with the university. So then in order to get diagnosed, and it's different across different spaces, you have to find either a specialized clinical psychologist in some cases, or you have to find a psychiatrist, or in some countries you could find some kind of doctor. But it can be quite difficult, When I talk to people in the UK, if you went for an application through the NHS, there's a waiting list of 9 years, last I heard. So a lot of it can be a really long, and often people end up going the private route, so it can be a very expensive process as well.
When you found out that you had ADHD, did you then look back and in hindsight could then find out the signs? Can you tell us about sort of figuring out that finally you had an answer as to why things happened the way that it happened? I would love to get a couple of examples for you so that some of my listeners can either relate to it or then say, nope, no, that's not me.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So I think the biggest thing for me that I realized is a couple of things. One was I was burning out a
Mm,
lot. So my academic career looked like I would like do something like a master's and then I would like take a year between that and the doctorate because I needed to do something else. But really, I was just burning out. I was pushing myself very hard to finish those degrees. And then the other thing was that every single, like my honors and my master's and my doctorate, they were all in completely different subjects. And that was apparent looking back, that was very ADHD. I kept thinking that if I could just find the right discipline or the right job, if you will, like the right focus, then I would be technically neurotypical because surely all of these struggles that I was having, they must be because I wasn't just passionate enough about the topic. And so I would jump from one thing to the other. Even in some cases, people would be like, I don't think you're allowed to jump this many times, but I did it anyway. And it was, I'm happy I have such a multifaceted knowledge base now, but it was very much ADHD.
yes. So funny you say that. I've been listening to a podcast called How to Take Over the World. Have you heard about it?
I have heard of it, but I can't remember what
Yeah.
it's about. Yeah.
Fascinating. And the presenter didn't sort of say anything about ADHD when he was explaining Leonardo da Vinci, but I just thought I bet that man had ADHD because
Mm-hmm.
he had a real difficulty finishing his paintings, and painting
Mm,
wasn't his only pursuit,
yeah.
his only purpose. He
Mm-hmm.
he was a science man. He there had so many other amazing things that he wanted to do and wrote about and talked about, and
Mm,
hardly ever finished anything and still was an absolute genius. So the word ADHD was not mentioned in the episodes about him, but I kept
mm.
thinking,
I think there's a book about
yeah,
him being ADHD, so I
all
think you're
right.
right. Yeah, I
Okay,
remember
okay.
reading that when I first got diagnosed. It was him or some other, but I
Yeah.
think it was him. Yeah.
Yeah. But then there is this, do you also find that when you tell people you have ADHD, the first thing that people say is, oh, all these geniuses and billionaires have ADHD, and then it puts another level of pressure on you?
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, well, the good news is you get ADHD diagnosis and then they hand you your, ticket to become the next whoever we're going
Bill
to be talking
Gates.
about now and it's done. That's it. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not really like that, is it?
no, not at all. And a lot of time it's, at least for me it was a complex thing and I've noticed this a lot with clients I work with as well. It's like there's a relief that you've figured it out because usually by that time it's been a while. You've been, you know, it's at least when you're getting the diagnosis, it's usually because you think you have ADHD. So you've been thinking about it and looking at the research. And
Hmm.
so it's like, okay, it's not just me. There is a thing. That's
Yeah.
great. But then you have to think back and go, oh, wow. So this is really affecting my life. And it's affected my life in these ways. And these are the things that might have been different if I'd known. And so you have to, deal with that. And then, yeah, it also throws into, what does it mean for where I am now? Like, what do I want to do with my life? Those things as well become shaded differently when you find out you have ADHD.
What what were your biggest challenges once you found out that you had the diagnosis? You were halfway through your PhD or beginning your PhD. What happened then? How did the diagnose and knowing it changed how you did you finish your PhD? Let's start there.
That's a good question. Yeah, so I didn't, but not for the reasons you'd think. So for me, it was mostly I would say a positive thing. So really what was helpful for me was that I had what I would say over-engineered my organizational systems prior to my ADHD diagnosis. So I was somebody who was trying to be very, very organized because there's so many pieces to do, when you're doing academia, so many papers and documents and things. But that also meant that I was working sort of a lot harder than I needed to. So understanding, okay, this bit is helping my working memory, so that's important. But this bit, I just did it one time and it seemed to work. It's not actually important. So I could take out some of the pieces that weren't as useful and sort of streamline it. I also started, and this was kind of the beginning of the organization I run today, the very, very beginning. I worked as an adult educator for about 8 years. And then I, as soon as I found out I had ADHD, I asked if I could run a group for postgraduates who are neurodiverse. I really wanted to learn about the community and sort of do that kind of thing. So that was helpful as well, in being able to do that and sort of dive into it in that way immediately. And then yeah, I sort of kept learning. And when COVID hit, so I was still doing my PhD during COVID, I ended up transitioning into what I do now by sort of taking on some coaching clients, and their business grew and grew until I had to make a decision between the PhD and the business, and I
that's awesome.
decided unfortunately, I could come back to the PhD, but the business was my chance. So I did it, and I'm really glad I did. It was a big decision, though.
So when clients come to you looking for professional support, what is it that they're facing? What are the sort of key challenges that you see happen again and again for professionals with ADHD?
The first challenge I would say is just absolute overwhelm. Most people who come are completely overwhelmed. It's usually one more thing has happened that has caused a lot of overwhelm. So people, especially during COVID was a big source of overwhelm. Now it could be taking on a new project, having kids, but usually people are sort of saying, hey, I barely had my organizational systems together. I was handing in things mostly on time. I was, keeping track of my events that were coming up, kind of. I was talking to my family and friends semi-regularly, and then something else happened and that whole thing just fell apart, and now I really need help. That's usually where people are at.
Yeah. And I have no idea, this is a genuine question. When you have ADHD, is it likely that you also have other things going on? I have an invisible disease, and what I have found is that there is potential for me to develop other things with my condition. Is that something that happens with ADHD?
Yeah, it does appear to be. If we look at the research, there's sort of a correlation between ADHD and dyslexia, ADHD and autism. So, often it's considered a bit of a cloud of different neurodiverse conditions. So, yeah, it's something that people often recommend figuring out. But it can be hard to test for some of them, like dyscalculia, dyslexia. These things are not always easy to diagnose, especially in adults.
Yeah. Do you bring that up, and is it a sensitive, I'm assuming it must be very delicate, like once you start working with a client, you're not you're not their therapist, you're
not
their
at all.
coach. So where do you draw the
Yeah.
line, Sky?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think that line is really important. And what I try and do, so I will never diagnose it. I'll never even suggest anybody is anything other than what they say. And sometimes people will come to me and they haven't been diagnosed with ADHD yet. So we're just helping with executive dysfunction at that point. But sometimes, I am aware of the different supports that are out there. And if somebody says, hey, I work super well visually, but I find it hard to read, then we'll just sort of support them where they're at with whatever they need. Some of these things are kind of overlapping anyway. And then, if they did say hey, I'm struggling with emotional regulation or I'm struggling with, something else, sometimes what I'll do is I will be the person who helps them find the support that they need, and also helps them write down and remember why they needed that support and what that was for. So I can kind of help bridge that gap a little bit, because actually getting access to those resources in itself can be an executive functioning task.
Oh, yes, yes. And we count ourselves lucky in Australia, but even here it's very hard to get the support that we need. You and I are very similar in that way. And sometimes I catch up with other coaches and they're horrified with my methods. So I'm going to share with you, because it sort of resonated with me, what you said, you accept people as they are. As a career coach, helping people look for work, usually we say, oh, you have to network, right? But I have worked with clients that are extremely introverted or, have some sort of neurodiversity, and networking for them is a source of great anxiety. And I just go, okay, fine. Let's find other ways to help you find a job. It's not impossible. Yeah, it's a door that we close, but we need to be good at other things if networking is an issue for you.
Interesting.
So I really do take that on board. Like other clients have come to me and said, I hate applying with recruiters. I only like getting jobs through my network. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not, as a coach, I'm not going to, you're adult. I am going to help you play your game. I'm not going to make you play my game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the interesting thing about ADHD, at least in the years that I've been coaching, we are very similar, and a lot more similar than we often realize. Like, obviously everyone is really different, but often people will come to me and they'll say like, hey, this is a thing, I'm telling you. Sometimes they haven't even told anyone, and I really appreciate them sharing. But also, that's about the third time I've heard that exact thing that week. Which, because we often have the similar struggles, like, I'll give you an example. Sometimes with ADHD, it can be difficult to remember to brush your teeth. Like, this is the thing I hear from like a number of clients in different ways, to the point where somebody will say that and they'll be like, I can't believe I told you that. And I'll be like, yeah, that's fine. Like, and I already have some strategies in place to help you with that, because, so I meet people where they're at. Really important. I say, bring your worst self to coaching. That's usually the best self to work with, and often, that self is the self that, like, yeah, we understand how to work with it. And it's not as painful as it sounds like it's going to be, because I think often people think like, right, it's time to get serious. It's time to do the thing in the most horrible, hard way. And no, we have strategies around dopamine and things like that to make everything, even applying for a job, less painful. And I think people are often they just don't know what they don't know around that sort of thing.
Yeah, I saw some of your videos about spreading out the dopamine throughout the day. I thought that was
Yeah.
really interesting. And I'm going to take that on board. I think it's, if it works for people that have ADHD, it will work for everybody else too, right? It's
Yeah.
such a good
Yeah.
idea. I'm going to share that little clip in the episode show notes, and you can talk a little bit more about it as well. But I wanted to ask you a question about what you said before, applying for jobs when you have ADHD, and that can be, a source of anxiety for everybody, but I'm assuming, even more so for people that have ADHD. The other thing that I have discussed with my clients that have ADHD, I've had clients in the past, I have clients right now as well, is, should I tell them or
Ah.
not? Is it that obvious? I have worked with other clients with neurodiversity, and that has been something that we discussed, and sometimes we opt for yes, and sometimes we opt for no. Do you have views about this, or is it bespoke according to the client?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say I still wouldn't. I think it is on a case by case basis. But one of the things I like to ask, and also, I get this question from managers a lot, like, how do we make it more encouraging so that people will, disclose their ADHD? Because usually people think they know, but they don't always know if someone has ADHD. And, one of the things I often ask is, okay, well, where is that information going? Like, if you tell your supervisor, does your supervisor know now? Or does every person who is above your supervisor in this whole organization know now too? Like, where is this, and what's the through line, and how does that affect promotions and things like that? Because, sometimes we can be a little bit, we can get stressed out or overwhelmed and just say, I have ADHD and that's why this is happening. And I would say that, of all the different ways to disclose, it's probably the most relatable, but it's not necessarily the way you want to do it, because it's now you're going to have to like, that's usually sometimes what people will end up working with us, because they'll say like, hey, I got really stressed out and I told everyone I had ADHD because I recently got diagnosed and I was working through it and now I don't know what to do. So yeah, if you do decide to do it, I'd say do it as a stepped process. Like tell maybe someone you trust and see how you feel, and then tell somebody else and see how you feel, just so that you can make sure that you're not doing it in an impulsive way, which can be a thing that we do sometimes. I have
Yeah,
ADHD too, so I get it.
yeah, you're right. I think when I have seen it happen was when there was a lot of intentionality to it, not just a bravery and a need to be your true self, but also to maybe support others in the organization, or the person felt that they were in a position of power somewhat, that it wouldn't really hurt them. They had already proven their worth. They had already been in the organization for
Yeah, that
quite
makes
some
sense.
time. So that was
Yeah.
and frankly, sometimes it's just because it's so obvious.
Yeah, yeah. Although that one is quite funny because, one of the people that groups I got to work with recently, or a couple of years ago, was New Zealand's intelligence services, because they found out that pretty much like so many people in their departments had ADHD.
Oh
They asked me to
wow.
come in and talk to managers about it and how to manage it. And, sometimes whole departments will be very, very high in ADHD, like that particular department. There'll be this thing of like, well, people who work in this industry are like this. And it's like, or maybe those people all have ADHD. So sometimes that can be the case as well. People can group together because they all like the same kind of job. It's not, it makes sense when you think about it.
Yes, it does. It does. And we have identified other traits in, yeah, narcissism. I mean, these crazy things that we have identified, depression, for example,
Oh,
in
wow.
legal and in choosing law and dentistry. Have you seen that research?
No, I have not seen that research. That's crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah, there is. I forgot his name. I have his book here. I haven't seen the. I have seen the articles about it and the meta-analysis, but I first found it in the book Pursuit for Happiness, I think. And yeah, and it had identified that people with a tendency for depression would often choose legal studies or dentistry. And and it's not only correlated, but you would have the tendency and then choose the profession and not the other way around. It's
Yeah.
not that being a dentist would make you depressed. It's that you would, in high school, they did the analysis and then came up to that conclusion.
Yeah.
So I think that there are traits that would in sales, a lot of people
Yeah.
know that already, that you're more
Yeah.
optimistic if you go into sales.
Entrepreneurship as well.
Yeah, so
We're very highly represented in
yeah,
anything.
learned
I was
optimism is a good book to understand some of that optimism, pragmatism, realism, pessimism, and the choice of professions, because Martin Seligman did quite a lot of work on that.
Yeah, we learned about him in psychology, so
Yeah, yeah,
all
yeah.
about him. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned some strategies that you discuss with your clients to manage their ADHD professionally in professional settings, and I mentioned the video that I watched. Is it okay for you to kind of describe some of those
Of
strategies
course.
for us? I'd
Yeah.
love to
More
hear.
than happy. I guess could you give me like an example of what somebody's doing, like what you would imagine, and I can kind of give you a strategy.
Okay, I think that some of the examples I've seen with my clients with ADHD had to do with managing the execution of like a big event for the company. That
Oh
was
yeah.
part of their responsibility, and they had a team, and it would be sort of make or break in terms of what it meant
Yeah.
for their roles, and that
Yeah.
was a great source of, as you said, overwhelm for them.
Yeah. I
What
can
would you
imagine.
recommend?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces here, and one of the things I like to do, like I said, I'm a former academic, I kind of can't help myself, is go into a bit of why this is happening. So, you know, we struggle a lot with working memory and time blindness. Those are two executive functioning struggles we have. So, the working memory piece is that it can be hard to break things down into pieces. There's actually an AI that I recommend that can help with that, which just came out recently, that will kind of help you break things down if you do struggle with that. But also the time blindness. It can be really hard for us to estimate time. It's all kind of, I often describe it as being feeling a little bit fuzzy, and it can be very difficult to understand how those two things are going together. So if you are planning a big project, obviously those are two very important things. So, one of the things that is really important to do at the beginning is to actually go ahead and set aside some time, use, different tools like the AI systems, etc., to break things down and then estimate and double check your estimates with maybe somebody who might have an understanding of it, someone who might have done it before, or if in doubt, double it. You'd be surprised how often that one is accurate. Break down how long everything's going to take, and try and actually put it into some kind of visual system so you can see how it works. So that would be step one of actually even understanding the thing. But then we have to do it, and that's where that dopamine comes in. One of the things we know from the research is we don't receive as much dopamine reward neurotransmitter, that kind of thing, from starting a task as neurotypicals. People are still arguing about why, but what that means for us essentially is that we're just less motivated to do something. So while you traditionally think about the idea of getting a reward at the end of a task, when you have ADHD, it's highly recommended you have a reward at the beginning of the task. That's kind of some of the research that we've seen. And so starting a task, a boring task, by saying, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to, sit somewhere I like, I'm going to go to a coffee shop and grab a coffee, maybe get some smoothie, whatever it is for you, listen to some music, and have that as kind of a starting off point can be helpful to get into the task. And there's just so many other strategies, but they're all kind of around those executive functioning struggles.
Oh my gosh, I may have ADHD. Yesterday, I had to do something really boring as part of my work, and just a boring report that I had to produce. And I'm like, oh, this is so hard. My office was so cold. I turned on the
Yeah.
heater. I went upstairs. I kid you not, I watched the full movie that I love. And after watching that movie, I felt like I was happy enough to to come
Yeah.
downstairs with a warm office and produce the report, listening to music. It all made, the task so much more enjoyable. I didn't even need something at the end of it. I was so happy to have watched a lovely movie in the middle of the afternoon. All right, so that's interesting. That's I think a really good idea if you have a big milestone coming up. What about when you have to comply with the day-to-day business as usual, kind of boring work? That's something else that I have noticed with some of my clients with ADHD. And it kind of makes sense what you said before, because I usually work with people that are in transition. So they get a job, they get super excited, they got a job, and then the job actually starts. And there's nothing actually wrong with the work, but it's just not as exciting anymore. And I
Yeah.
find that they come back and say, "Oh, so tell
Yeah.
me, how can we get used?" That's when the dopamine
Yeah.
idea
That's when the
sort of
dopamine
made
idea
sense
comes
to me.
in. Yeah.
Okay.
So, so there's a couple of pieces here, and I want to talk about something that isn't the dopamine exactly. Because one of the things that can happen a lot is, we can really struggle around this idea of just having so many things coming at us. People can be very overwhelmed. There's so many things coming at you. And so, one of the things that can often be very helpful is to go, okay, well, let's get a sense of which of these tasks you have to do, and then which of these tasks do you have to do today, or there'll be a significant negative consequence, or this week, or there'll be a significant negative consequence. And I say that because, again, it can be hard to break things down when you're struggling with executive dysfunction. So thinking about it in terms of, okay, I feel like there's a million things I have to do and they all have to be done right now, but I'm too tired and distracted and haven't got enough dopamine to do any of them. So I'm just kind of flicking between tabs, which is where we can find ourselves. And so being able to do the little, what we call prioritization filter exercise can help you get down to, okay, I have to do these two things, or else I will not be prepared for the meeting that is happening tomorrow morning. Everything else doesn't have to be done for the next 7 days. That's what I'm going to attend to. That's what I'm going to get dopamine to help me to start. That's what I'm going to break down, write down the steps for. That's what I'm going to, transition down into. We talk about turning down the distraction dial. So kind of going from like watching a movie to podcast to music, trying to like turn down the dial so you can get to that deep focus.
Yes, sounds wonderful. And we mentioned before that you said managers come to you to ask for advice on how to support individuals with ADHD. What would be something that the workplace can do, right? Because I find this interesting, even without thinking about ADHD. We're in a era now where we very quickly, very rapidly transitioned from everybody's in the workplace. You are lucky if you have one day that you work from home. That was pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
Now we are all over the place, really, literally all over the place. Some people have to come full time into the office. Some are hybrid, some are remote. The management style for these three ways of working is slightly different. I also feel that the employee value has completely changed. People's ambitions have changed, and it's kind of it must be very hard for managers and leaders to know what to do from, things like when people are in the office, should they all be sitting and quietly working, or should they should they be talking to each other and having a
Yeah.
chat because they haven't seen each other in real life for so long? When do you draw the line
Yeah.
on all of those behaviors, and how to then account for people that are struggling with burnout, with mental health, with the different ways of working because they are neurodiverse. It
Yeah.
must be very, very exhausting to almost think about all of these things all at once.
Yeah, I guess it must do. I mean, I run an organization and I also have a large community of exclusively neurodiverse people, pretty much. So, but we all work online, which I think is nice.
Yeah.
The main thing I would say is that flexibility is key. Like flexibility is something people have, I would argue people have wanted for a while. And now that it's here, it's going to be hard for it to be removed. So you don't have to be flexible. You can have very strong, rules, but then you're not going to attract certain kinds of people. You're not going to keep certain kinds of people. So if you want to support, more neurodiverse people and that kind of thing, flexibility is key, by which I mean having different ways of working, different places of working, because sometimes it is nice to work in a collaborative environment. Sometimes you're just trying to get that deep work report done, and the best way to get that done is by going to a coffee shop and working there, or working from home early in the morning and being able to come in a little bit later as a result. So, focusing on the output and letting the system be a bit more flexible is one of the ways that you can support ADHD.
Yeah, And basically everybody else too. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
What about future trends and advancements that you're seeing in this area? I think it's fascinating to see what else we can learn. ADHD seems to be such a large umbrella.
Yeah.
What else
Yeah,
is
well,
going to happen?
I will say, I've been keeping an eye on this area, and it hasn't stopped growing. Like, it has not. Like, people are still getting diagnosed. People are, a lot of the diagnosis is people who are now finding out in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond, that they have ADHD and that they didn't realize it. And so this, while it feels like, oh, this is a huge thing and everyone knows about it now, there's still a lot of people who are learning about it and who are understanding it for the first time, and some of it, as well as now this, people have gone, okay, I've accepted that I have ADHD. I've known this for a couple of years now, and I'm ready to like make some changes in my life as a result of it. So I think that understanding how many people have ADHD and how many people are neurodiverse is just going to grow.
Yeah. Do you worry about a backlash of, oh, now everybody has ADHD?
Not
How do you
really,
respond
because
to that?
I think that's always been the case. I think the second somebody got diagnosed with ADHD, somebody else was like, "Well, that's, everyone has that. Everyone has a bad day." How I would respond to that is basically how the diagnosis is made. Like, it's persistent and pervasive across different parts of your life and across different times in your life. So everybody struggles with certain tasks at certain times, definitely.
Yeah.
But if this is something that's persistent and pervasive across different times and different, areas of your life, then yeah, you might want to consider finding out if you have ADHD. You might have it. And the reason you think everyone has it might be because they have it too, because one of the things we know is that it runs in families, and people who are friends, you know, people who are neurodiverse tend to connect with other neurodiverse people. So that's another factor as well. Is like it might look like it happens to you and everyone else because it actually does.
Wow. Okay. How can we be great allies then? Somebody tells me they have ADHD. What's the best response that I can give them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think the first response is cool. That's always a good one. And, the other one, if people do, is just ask people what they need, because people are going to have different needs, and also don't expect the person to have a full understanding of what they need right now, especially if they have if they've just been diagnosed. A lot of times when people come to our organization, they, come because they're like, I found out I have ADHD. I told my employer, they said, how can we help you? And I said, I have no idea. And so now we're both kind of asking you.
Ah, great, great. And how do you think recruitment? Okay, let me give you some background. I think that the traditional recruitment and selection process is not conducive for diversity and inclusion. Right?
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
not. When I was in charge of recruitment and selection, together with my wonderful support, Judith Landsberg, we used to ensure that we changed things around when we knew that the candidates needed the panels that were interviewing them to be more open-minded. So instead of doing, well, alongside preparing the candidates for the recruitment and selection process, we actually spent way more time preparing the panelists that were the decision makers to be more open-minded, to understand the reason, what the output was supposed to be,
Yeah.
what it is that we were trying to achieve by recruiting, the candidates for these sort of amazing opportunities, instead of being led by conscious or unconscious biases that they may have. But even then, the fact that you have something in paper and then come in and do a very big performance in front of, a group of people, which is usually how interviews work. I'm not even talking about the ADHD. Any sort of introvert would relate to it being extremely difficult and a source of anxiety. If you had to design a way to make recruitment and selection of professionals fairer for people with ADHD, what would it look like?
That's a great question. So I can't tell you how to make it fair, but I can tell you how to make it more ADHD friendly. So I will, I've spoken to a lot of people, and I do know that there's a lot of jobs that don't get applied for by neurodiverse people who would be great for those jobs. It's always interesting to me when jobs that require people who are maybe good at creative problem solving, good at creative thinking, not good at filling out forms, like a job would benefit from that, doesn't have an application process that fits a person who does that. Like, that's always very interesting to me. When we were, because we've hired people and we've hired coaches, is, one of the things we do is, we try not to put especially at the beginning, to put as little paperwork as possible in front of you and the person. So what we did with the coaches was we had LinkedIn job ads, and we took out the cover letter and we just asked people to respond to a few relevant questions. And then we asked people to have I think it was like a 15-minute conversation who met the criteria. So we sort of did it on LinkedIn because people were already kind of in that space, and we didn't really ask people to double up on information in that way. And then from there, we kind of did additional things. And then at that point, if you're really like, you've got a couple of people and you ask somebody to write, at that point, maybe a cover letter. Because at that point, if you have ADHD, you really want this job. You know that you're, only like down to the wire. There's a very specific deadline. It's a lot easier to do that kind of thing than it is when you're just handing out cover letters to the world with no expectation of a response.
Good point. That's the reason why probably so many people hate doing cover letters.
Yeah, I think everybody dislikes cover letters.
I remember disliking them and really not seeing the point. I later learned how to do them well, and I teach that, but gosh, nobody likes it. Have we forgotten to talk about something special, something important that you want the audience to know?
Nothing that I can think of, no.
I think that having you here is a dream come true for me. I have been seeking out somebody to talk about ADHD for a long time, and I am so happy that you reached out and that we now know each other so that I can refer you some clients and that we can work in collaboration, because I think the work you're doing is wonderful. I really like it. I think it's so necessary, and most importantly, understanding how we can better, like I said before, design the recruitment and selection process that is more inclusive and have leaders more understanding of what people need to do to achieve the performance and the output that they need, regardless of what it looks like to them. It may look odd to you, but this is what we need to do. We need a break right now.
Yeah.
We need a coffee right now. So lovely. So it's wonderful to have you here, Sky. And I'll have a link below
thank you so
to
much.
your website, to your LinkedIn, and people can reach out to you.
Yeah, and I will say, if anybody, because I know podcast listeners, you're always looking for another podcast, we have a podcast as well. It's called the ADHD Skills Lab, and we interview professionals with ADHD. We get, into the weeds of what their day looks like. We've had people like the president of Chad, Netflix directors, and we also talk about the latest research, so it's a good spot.
Oh, Sky, maybe I could recommend some of my clients to be interviewed on your podcast.
Yes, please do. I love talking to, people. Even if you have interviewed teachers, like just people who have jobs who are willing to to give us the details of how they do it and the strategies that they've managed to develop, because it's pretty cool and we all need some strategies.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.